Millicent was not the kind of girl people noticed immediately. She did not laugh loudly, nor did she speak unless necessary. Yet there was something about her presence, quiet, steady, and deeply observant, that made people remember her long after she had walked away. She worked in a small office in town, handling paperwork with precision and calmness that never seemed to break. Every day followed the same rhythm: early morning walks, long hours at her desk, and evenings spent alone with her thoughts. To outsiders, her life appeared peaceful, almost perfect. But inside, Milicent lived a silence that was heavier than words. She had learned early in life that speaking too much often led to disappointment, so she chose instead to listen, to watch, and to understand. People often mistook her quietness for weakness, but they did not realize it was her greatest strength. She saw things others ignored: intentions behind smiles, truths hidden in casual conversations, and emotions people tried to bury. Millicent carried her past like a shadow, never fully escaping it, yet never allowing it to break her completely. She believed that some stories were not meant to be told, only lived, and hers was just beginning to unfold. I met Millicent on an ordinary afternoon that did not feel important at the time. The sun was high, the town busy, and life moving as usual. She was standing near a bus stage holding a small bag, her eyes scanning the road as if waiting for something more than just transport. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, yet something about her stillness drew my attention. While others rushed around, she stood calm, almost detached from the noise. When our eyes met briefly, she did not look away quickly like most people would. Instead, she held the gaze for a second longer, as if trying to read something within me. That small moment felt strangely significant. Later, we spoke casually, exchanging simple words that carried no weight at first. But even in that short conversation, I noticed something different about her. She did not speak to impress or entertain. She spoke only when she had something meaningful to say. There was honesty in her tone, a rare kind that felt both comforting and unsettling. I did not know then that this quiet girl would soon become one of the most complicated chapters of my life. Our conversations with Millicent grew slowly, almost naturally, without effort or force. We would meet occasionally, sometimes planned, sometimes by chance, and each time the connection deepened in ways I could not fully explain. She never demanded attention, yet she commanded it effortlessly. There was something grounding about her presence, a calmness that made the world feel less chaotic. Unlike others, Millicent did not try to change me or challenge me loudly. Instead, she listened, truly listened, in a way that made me feel understood without needing to explain everything. It was both comforting and dangerous. I found myself sharing thoughts I rarely spoke aloud, trusting her silence more than words from anyone else. Yet there was always a distance she maintained, a part of herself she never allowed me to reach. Sometimes I would catch her lost in thought, her eyes distant as if remembering something painful she refused to speak about. I wanted to ask, to understand, but something told me she would not answer. That mystery drew me closer, even as it warned me to be careful. With Millicent, nothing was ever simple. It was quiet, deep, and slowly consuming. The more time I spent with Millicent, the more I realized that her silence was not emptiness. It was protection. She had built walls so carefully that most people never even noticed they existed. At times, she would smile, soft and genuine, and for a moment it felt like those walls were fading. But just as quickly, she would retreat into herself, her eyes turning distant again. One evening, as we sat quietly watching the sunset, I finally asked her what she was always thinking about. She paused, not out of confusion, but as if weighing whether the truth was worth revealing. "Some things are better left where they belong," she said softly. It was not a refusal, but it was not an answer either. That moment stayed with me. I began to understand that Millicent carried more than she showed: memories, pain, perhaps even regrets that shaped the way she moved through life. I wanted to break through that silence, to be the one person she could trust completely. But deep down, I sensed that forcing her to open up would only push her further away. With Milicent, patience was not a choice, it was the only way. There are moments when silence becomes louder than words, and with Milicent, those moments were frequent. We could sit together for long periods without speaking, yet somehow it never felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like we were communicating in ways that did not require language. One rainy evening, we found ourselves stranded under a small shelter, watching the rain fall heavily around us. She leaned slightly closer, not out of need, but out of quiet acceptance. That simple gesture spoke more than any confession could. For the first time, I felt that maybe I was getting closer to understanding her, but just as I began to feel certain, she pulled away again, as if reminding both of us that closeness had limits. Milicent was not afraid of connection, she was afraid of what came after it. Loss, disappointment, betrayal, these were things she had experienced before, even if she never said it directly. I began to realize that her silence was not meant to shut people out, but to protect herself from being broken again. Loving someone like Milicent was not about grand gestures. It was about understanding the quiet spaces she lived in. As time passed, I started noticing a change in Milicent. The meetings became less frequent, the conversations shorter, and the silence heavier than before. It was not sudden, but gradual, like something slowly slipping away without warning. When I asked if everything was okay, she would simply nod and say she was fine, but her eyes told a different story. There was a distance growing between us, one I could not close no matter how hard I tried. I found myself questioning everything. Had I done something wrong, or had I misunderstood what we shared? One evening, she told me she needed time to focus on herself. The words were simple, but they carried a finality I could not ignore. I wanted to argue, to ask her to stay, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the understanding that Milicent had always been this way, close yet distant, present yet unreachable. As she walked away that evening, I realized that some people come into your life not to stay, but to teach you something you were not ready to learn. And with Milicent, the lesson was just beginning. After that evening, Milicent became a memory that still moved like a shadow in my daily life. We did not have a dramatic ending, no argument, no clear goodbye, just silence that slowly replaced everything we once shared. Days turned into weeks, and her absence began to feel heavier than her presence ever did. I would pass the places we used to meet and find myself pausing, half expecting to see her standing there, calm as always, watching the world with quiet eyes. But she was never there. I tried to move on, to convince myself that what we had was not as deep as it felt, yet something inside me refused to accept that. Milicent had a way of leaving without leaving completely. Her words, her silence, even her distance remained with me. I realized that sometimes the hardest goodbyes are the ones never spoken. They leave questions unanswered and emotions unresolved. With Milicent, I did not lose her all at once. I lost her slowly in pieces, until all that remained was a quiet emptiness I could not explain. Looking back, I began to understand the things I had ignored while we were still close. Milicent had never promised me anything. She had never said she would stay, never asked me to depend on her, never gave me certainty. Everything I felt had grown in the spaces between her words, in the silence I had mistaken for connection. The truth was simple, yet difficult to accept. I had seen what I wanted to see. Milicent had been honest in her own way, but I had chosen to read deeper meanings into her actions. That realization did not make the pain disappear, but it gave it shape. It allowed me to see the situation clearly without blaming her or myself entirely. Sometimes people enter your life not to build something permanent, but to reflect parts of you that you do not fully understand. Milicent had shown me my need for connection, my fear of losing it, and my tendency to hold on even when there was nothing to hold. That truth was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Growth, I realized, often begins with accepting what we tried so hard to avoid. Time did what it always does. It moved forward whether I was ready or not. Slowly, the weight of Milicent's absence began to change. It did not disappear, but it became something I could carry without breaking. I returned to my routines, to my work, and to the parts of life I had neglected while caught in my thoughts. But this time something was different. I was more aware, more careful, and perhaps a little wiser. I no longer rushed into connections or assumed meanings where none were given. Milicent had not destroyed me, she had reshaped me. The silence she left behind became a space where I learned to understand myself better. I began to appreciate clarity over confusion, honesty over assumption, and presence over uncertainty. Though I rarely spoke her name, I often thought about her, not with pain, but with a quiet respect. She had been a lesson disguised as a person, a chapter that ended without closure but left behind meaning. And sometimes that is enough. Now, when I think of Milicent, I do not see loss, I see understanding. She was never meant to stay, and perhaps that was the point all along. Not every connection is meant to last forever. Some exist only to change you in ways you cannot see at the time. Milicent taught me that silence can hold truth, that distance can be intentional, and that not all stories need a perfect ending to have value. There is a quiet strength in letting go, in accepting that some people will remain part of your past, not your future. I no longer search for answers in what she left unsaid. Instead, I carry forward what I learned from her presence. Life, I have come to understand, is not about holding on to everyone we meet, but about growing through the experiences they bring. Milicent was never loud, never dramatic, never obvious, but she was unforgettable. And sometimes the quietest people leave the deepest marks.